Okay, so we've gone through the germination process, we have uncovered our trays, and once we've done that, we are now putting them into the light, and that moves us onto the crop growth or the greening stage or the photosynthetic stage. So as we get into the growing process, there's a number of things we need to consider. Is there sufficient light for our crop? Many customers are after the chlorophyll content you find in green plants, so that's really important. What is the weather going to be like? Which means how quick is the crop going to grow and how much watering is it going to need? Is it going to be hot or cold, and how is that going to cause us to change our system? Is the crop ahead or behind? Do we need to slow it up or speed it down? Are we seeing signs of disease? Are we seeing poor germination? So there's a lot of stuff to consider, which over time will just become commonplace. You'll know very quickly, within a day or two, whether your crop is behind germination-wise and whether you need to increase the temperature. You're going to know the weather because you're going to get much better at watching the forecast and maybe even having some weather monitoring inside and outside of your growing system. So these things will become intuitive and you will develop good systems, but in the beginning there's a lot of trial and error and a lot of oversight, and hopefully with a little bit of information here, it does help you recognize those things quicker. So here's just a few shots of the system where things have greened up quite a bit. Obviously, the light is a huge role in photosynthesis, and we'll talk about that. And so let's take a look at some of the factors that go into crop growth and what we're looking at. So there's 6 main factors to look at when we're thinking about optimum crop growth. So I love when they come out of order. That just makes me feel so professional. Okay, so number 1 is germination quality. We've talked about that quite a bit already. Proper light timing and intensity, and this is the same whether you're using sunlight or artificial light. Watering, temperature, and humidity. These are things that vary depending and often relative to each other. And then having the proper time or growth period for each crop. So let's take a look at some of these components. And again, looking at, we've just gone through our germination and stacking phase. We're uncovering the crop, and now it's starting to grow in the second half of its life cycle. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on germination quality. We've already talked about this quite a bit in this module, but just keep in mind it is very difficult to recover from poor germination. So a huge focus of your production process is ensuring that you've got really good conditions for germination and you're monitoring to make sure those conditions are doing what they should do. Once again, if things look a little behind because it's cool, you can bump up the temperature. If you're seeing disease, which is unlikely, over time, you might want to do a spray with hydrogen peroxide or peracetic acid. You may need to increase the airflow a little bit. If you're seeing very poor germination, you might want to think about what your seed source is, or if your soil isn't wet enough or isn't holding the water well enough. These are things to just consider, and you need to troubleshoot in steps, often determine where things might be a challenge. But if you're following a lot of the steps we've covered already, you should be getting good germination. Once again, it is very, very difficult to recover from poor germination at the beginning of the process. So we talked about light already earlier in one of our earlier modules. We're going to revisit it again here because this is the part of the process at which we introduce light to the crop. Now, for us, the type of light is very important. So visible light exists on a spectrum, and our goal is to use a spectrum high in blue light, or having a high Kelvin value. So a high Kelvin value in light generally promotes vegetative growth in crops, whereas if you have something high in the red spectrum, it tends to promote flowering and fruiting, and as well as internodal growth. So for something like peas, you'd find they really stretch and there's big spaces between the leaves. So this blue light requirement is actually very, very important because this is a crop we are not seeing through a full life cycle. If you're growing something and it's got a vegetative and then a flowering and then a fruiting stage, that change in light is really different. We are actually just looking at a very, very small portion of a plant's natural cycle, all in the vegetative state, and at which we want a lot of vegetative growth. So very important that we're using blue light there. In terms of hours of light, this really varies. As a general guideline, 12 to 16 hours is sort of the range you're looking at. And this may seem a little low or a little high, depending on the kind of light you're used to where you live. Now in Vancouver here, we have close to a 16-hour day length in the summer, so we almost have no choice but to have 16 hours of light in the summer season. In the winter, the lighting period goes down to about 8.5 to 9 hours. So we're using supplementary light to extend that. Now, light is a cost, which means we're using electricity to run light. And so the more light we use, the more power we're going to use, the higher our costs are going to be. Further, some of your lighting sources may be a source of heat. Actually, most of them will be a source of heat, and you need to balance the heat they give off with other temperature factors in your system. So ideally, you're going to use the minimum amount of light to get the most optimum result, which means if I can get really good growth with 14 hours of light, there's really no point in me using 16 hours of light. It's 2 hours of energy I'm using a day that I don't need to. So keep this in mind as you're growing about whether or not the additional light is adequate or required for your crops. I have read accounts of people who will actually give their crop 24 hours of light. I have no idea where this idea comes from or why they would do that, because it's very well established that plants do need a period of darkness for their effective growth, very much like humans need sleep in order to be healthy. So the idea that giving a crop light for its whole life cycle once it's in the light has never really made intuitive sense to me. I have found there are cases where we want to extend the lighting period if a crop is behind, because the light is giving the crop energy, and that can help move it forward a little bit if it's behind. And in the case of using a metal halide light that also gives off heat, it can bump the temperature up a little bit to help a crop catch up. So there's a lot of things to consider with light. As a general rule, though, yeah, we're going to use a light high in the blue spectrum and 12 to 16 hours of light. And ideally, we're using sunlight if that's an option. But if you're growing in a warehouse that's totally enclosed, then that's not going to be an option at all. Now, in a setup like this, which is literally just a home setup, but could be what a warehouse setup looks like, we're using fluorescent lights. These are cool white bulbs, about 5,000 Kelvin, so very high in the blue spectrum. And we're placing them quite close to the crop. The further away the light gets, the less intensity it's going to have, and you will get some reaching. So here, I would actually adjust the height of the lights depending on the crop stage and how it's doing. You can see a little bit in here. I certainly can. These, and we'll look at it in the next slide, these outside microgreens are actually leaning in towards the light. So even though we have very, very good light coverage here, we can actually see that there is a bit of a lean. So you can see it here as well. These ones are just sort of coming in. And you can see we've got very, very good coverage here. And in this case, what's really nice is we've got very, very good coverage with the light, but because of the proximity of the light to the crop, we're actually getting a little bit of heat there. And fluorescent bulbs don't give off a lot of heat, but they do give off some. So this means we can have a little bit of a microclimate right around the growing crop, which can really be a big advantage. If I want to increase the effect of the lights on that microclimate, I can bring them a little bit closer to the crop or take them away, depending on what we're looking for. As we talked about with a second covering in the crop, moving the lights away can cause them to stretch a little bit as well. So this is something you can play with as you get to know your cropping system. So like all growing plants, your microgreens need water, and they need regular watering, especially because we're generally using very, very shallow trays of soil. Now, the advantage of using a deeper tray of soil is that you would do less watering and have more rooting space. You're also going to use more soil in that case, and you're also going to need more storage space for that soil. Now, I will say the increased cost of soil in those trays relative to the increased yield you would get is negligible, and it would be worth it if yield is what you're looking at. The challenge in our system is actually just a lack of space of storage. So we may have had a higher yield by using more soil, which means we can grow less trays to get the yield we want, which means we're using less trays of soil overall. The amount of soil we'd have to bring in and manage was too much for our system. So you need to determine this stuff on a case-by-case basis. So there's lots of options for watering. I think there's generally 3 options to consider. This one here is a micro spray option, where we've got a mist of water going over the crop. You can hand water, which I actually a big believer in, only because it allows you to take a look at every tray multiple times a week, if not multiple times a day, while you're doing the watering. And then you can also water from underneath, like a type of flood watering. So in that case, you're not getting the crop wet at all. The roots are absorbing it from the soil, and the soil is drawing the water upward. All methods have advantages and disadvantages. One reason I don't like the micro spray in some systems is because there's a lot of overspray, and that can really influence humidity levels and bump the humidity levels up much higher. And with flood watering as well, I think it works really well, but there's an advantage with many crops of doing the overhead watering and getting the crop wet repeatedly. One of those advantages being you're essentially washing the crop while it's growing. And so when it comes to harvest time, when you cut that crop, if you're packaging it right away, you've actually done the washing of the crop while it's been growing, so you can package a fairly clean crop already. Where the flood watering comes in very handy is in crops that hold the water really well and don't dry out during the spin cycle. And a great example of that is radish, which really absorbs and holds onto the water. And so once it's uncovered and had one watering, we generally only water from below, so it can be cut very dry and go into the containers dry. There's a few things to consider with water in terms of factors. So one is temperature. And as a general rule, the higher the temperature, the more water your crop is going to need. Now this comes from 2 aspects of growing. Number 1 is you're going to get more evaporation of the water off the soil surface, and you're going to get a higher level of transpiration coming through the leaves of the plant. So drawing the water up from the soil through its roots and out through the leaves, which is what the process of photosynthesis really is. And so be prepared in higher temperature settings to use more water. And in the summer, if you're growing in natural sunlight and you have very hot conditions, this can actually mean watering 2 to 3 times a day, depending on your system, your soil depth, and how you're managing things. So keep that in mind, because that could be either a labor cost or an infrastructure cost in terms of irrigation installation. So soil is a factor, as we talked about, in terms of the depth of the soil, and the more soil you have there, the more water it can hold. But different soils have different water holding capacities. And even if you're using a basic peat, perlite, and compost mixture, the type of compost you're using, the grade or the fineness of the peat, the grade or the fineness of the perlite or vermiculite are all factors there. And I've definitely seen some variation in soils and their ability to hold water. Some soils hold water too well and are more likely to create anaerobic conditions. And some soils don't hold it well enough. So you're actually watering more than seems practical. So these are things to consider in your soil choice, and just really noticing, if you're having watering troubles, what are all the things that can be a factor? Temperature being one, soil depth being one, soil quality being another. So these are things that are really important to understand for troubleshooting. So the third factor is the crop. Now, different crops have different needs, and generally bigger, faster growing crops need more water. So I find sunflower and pea are crops that they soak up the water. They really need a lot because they're putting on a lot of mass, and they're combining that water with oxygen and energy to create sugars in order to grow. So you're going to see a lot of that, which means a lot of transpiration from those crops. Whereas when you get into the smaller crops, like the arugulas and all the brassicas and things like that, they do much better with smaller amounts of water, and so don't need as much. So there's a little more flexibility there. In theory, and actually in practice, you may find different soil mixes actually work different for different crops as well. This becomes a little more management, and I've never gone this route, but it is something worth considering if you are seeing significant differences in crop quality. You have 2 or even 3 different streams of soil that you use in order to get the results you need. And it could mean having a base soil, and then maybe you're adding a little more compost for one crop, or adding a little more perlite or vermiculite for another. So you don't have to have 3 separate streams, you just have a base one that you're adjusting. So this is definitely something to consider, something I've worked very hard to avoid to prevent having another step to follow, but could be a factor in successful crop growth, depending where you're growing and what your climate looks like. So one of the strategies I've used for controlling crop growth is using water stress. And it may seem a little counterintuitive, but during the summertime, when crops often maybe grow faster than I'd like them to grow, really the only way to slow them down in our system was to withhold water. Now, another way to slow stuff down would be to take it out of the growing environment and put it in a cooler space, or even a walk-in cooler. And you could take it and put it in a walk-in cooler for half a day. And that's something that can really slow the growth down. Now, if you've got 10 trays, that's, a simple thing to do. If you've got 200 trays, that's another thing. But if it means getting your harvest, your growth right for harvest day, you need to do what you need to do in order to get the best crop you can. Now, when we get really good crop growth in something like sunflower, we get a very, very high yield, but we generally don't get a very high quality crop. The growth gives you sort of a softer microgreen that doesn't tend to store as well. And so maybe it's okay for a couple of days of juicing, but if people are used to buying your crop, having very good storability, using it for fresh salads, they will notice a quality difference there. So we're trying to optimize our growth, not maximize our growth, because I know I can get 3 pounds of sunflower from a tray, but I know I can't get a very good sunflower crop when I'm producing that much. So one of the strategies we use, which works different for different crops, is to water stress crops. So you're withholding the water, it's slowing down growth, and in some crops to the point of wilt, but it's not killing them. You're not really going past the point of no return. And so because you're slowing down growth, it's slowing down the cycle, and you can reintroduce water in order to get the crop back on track. This works differently for different crops. I find it's very effective for sunflower, and I can get the crop right back to a really good position, whereas there's no way I could take a pea crop to the wilting stage. It just never quite recovers, whereas something like radish does, where some of the smaller microgreens do. So you need to learn this on a crop-by-crop basis, and their ability to do this, once again, may vary depending on your soil type. So here's a quick time lapse I've done of a sunflower crop that I was just growing in my home system that I let wilt. You can see how wilted it is, especially around these aspects here. And what I've done is I've soaked the tray in a tray of water, so it's absorbed the soil back to a really high point of water. And now we're seeing the recovery in that. So this, I believe, is over about a 4-hour period. And what we're going to see as things go on is that, and I actually haven't started the video this is a video of a video, funnily enough. So what we're going to see is some recovery of the crop. And what it is essentially is a reintroduction of water and turgidity into the crop. And so what that's doing is causing the cells and the stem to stiffen and straighten back out. And as I mentioned, this is over a 4-hour period. And so we'll tend to do an effective job of, you'll see how quickly you can recover. So let's see how this goes here once things get going. Now this one is actually very much past maturity. You can see actually lots of true leaves on there, but it's a good one to use as an example. And what I did was basically take a very dry tray, put it into a tray of water, let it soak up that water, and then just placed it back here and let it rehydrate. And so over about 1 minute and 10 seconds here, you can see the rehydration that took place over about 4 hours. So what you see is you can see here the crop starting to take up water and really reestablish its position. And
this works with a lot of crops. And what it allows you to do, if you've got a crop that's ahead of schedule, which is something that often happens in quite warm conditions, that you can slow down growth by reducing water. Now, this works really, really well with sunflower in particular. We use this a lot in the summer, and it also kind of changes the flavor and the texture as well. I find makes it a little more crunchy and nutty, and often you get a little bit of redness in the stem that shows up. So you can see this is the sort of thing where you can have a dehydrated tray, you could add water, and then overnight you would get almost complete recovery. And as I said, this video here was just taken over about 4 hours. So this was very, very, very fast recovery. So it's important to remember this, because one of the key things in a production system is always having your crops mature at the same time. And we determine our maturation times by experience, and we thus sow things on specific days. But sometimes we just can't do that, or we get the timing wrong, and we need to make adjustments. So this is a way to slow down crop growth while actually having very little negative effect on crop quality, and in many cases, I would say even improving crop quality. Now, this doesn't work equally well with all crops, so you need to test it out. I find, for example, pea shoots don't recover very well. Some of the finer microgreens don't always recover well, or might need a bit more time than sunflower here, which was about 4 hours. Some stuff is going to need a full day to recover. So this is something you're going to have to test out a little bit on your own. So yeah, just this is hopefully the visual gives you a sense of seeing, oh, okay, I can recover crops, and it can be quite beneficial to let them dehydrate. And yeah, I know that you know that you can get them back into a good marketable position.
Okay, so hopefully that was a good, useful look at that. Um, that was in a home system, and in a commercial system, I've definitely had 50 to 100 trays all wilting like that. And there's moments of panic when you're taking that sort of risk, but over time you realize that's definitely something that they can handle. So temperature. So I would say temperature is the number one factor in determining optimum crop growth. If it's too cold, crops tend to grow too slow or not at all, especially during the germination stage. And too hot, crops grow too fast or not at all. The germination is usually okay, but there's definitely a higher risk of disease, depending what other factors you take into consideration. So I'm always thinking about the weather and temperature, because this system here is reliant on sunlight. And while there is supplementary lighting, which would be sufficient to grow the crop on its own, the goal here is to be able to use sunlight to its maximum. It's this free source of energy, and we want to utilize that to keep our costs down and, to be honest, to ensure optimum crop quality. I never see crops as good grown in artificial light as I do in sunlight. The spectrum of light sunlight offers is just far superior to anything I've experienced with artificial light. And that includes using different types of fluorescence, sodium, high pressure sodium, metal halide. I don't have a lot of experience with LED, but my intuition tells me it's still not going to do as well as natural sunlight. So there's a couple things we need to consider in our light, and one is, or in our temperature, is whether we need to speed things up through adding heat or slow things down by cooling them, by removing heat. So often it's in the summertime we want to cool things down. If we're using natural light, it could be too intense. The sun is right above our head. It's a long period of time, and so there's just too much energy coming in. So while you might want to cool this down with something like an air conditioner, one of the most effective things is actually to use shading to cool things down. And in this greenhouse system, we use 2 layers of 55% coverage shade cloth. And that way we can even adjust the shade cloth. So if we're expecting a very sunny 8 or 10 days through our crop cycle, and we end up getting some cloudy days, we can remove layers of the shade cloth in order to get the light we need. So what we're really finding is that shade doesn't cause the stretching like you might think because of the heat, and it's really the most effective way to bring the temperature down. We're always thinking about airflow as well, and one thing we do is really keep airflow, fresh air coming in at night. So as the temperature drops at night, we can bring that cooler air into the system to cool stuff down before it starts heating up again in the morning. So that's a definite strategy. Now in the winter, our goal is to heat things up, which I find much easier than cooling things down. So in this case, we're just increasing the amount of time we have heat, and maybe increasing the wattage of heat that we use at any given time. And the factors there are really going to be how much power you have and how good your insulation is. If you're well insulated, you can use less wattage, but if you're not well insulated, you're going to need more heat in order to maintain that heat. Keeping in mind, you can use heaters as well as light for your heat source. And so that can really actually help manage that, and that's worked really well in this system. I talked previously about using under bench heating, so you're heating the bench directly, and that's heating the crop right above it. That's also a really good system, which is a very, very efficient use of energy. It just requires much more specific infrastructure. One of the challenges is shoulder seasons, where you get a lot of changing weather conditions. Your day length is changing rapidly. You might get half your grow cycle with a lot of sun and half of it with cloud and maybe some rain. So here in the Pacific Northwest, that's the spring and the fall. And interestingly, we get some of our best crop growth at that time because there's no extremes, but it takes a bit more management because we're never sure whether we're going to have a sunny day or a cloudy day. And forecasts become a little less predictable during those times. So this is something you're going to need to think about on a seasonal basis, is how to manage temperature in your greenhouse. So here's a few examples of what a temperature regime might look like. So in the winter, looking at having like a 20 degrees Celsius overnight temperature, and then as the day comes on, we bump up that temperature to 22, then 28. And so in the 12 to 4 period is sort of our when we've got the most sunlight, it's the growth period during the day. And then as the day goes on, we lower that down again. Now, if for some reason this temperature regime isn't enough and we're not getting enough crop growth, our number one strategy is to increase the nighttime temperature. So increasing the temperature during the dark period is when we see the best response in terms of growth. Bumping the temperature up from 22 to 24 at 10 o'clock or 28 to 30 at 12 o'clock doesn't seem to have as good an effect as keeping that, for example, maybe that 24 degrees Celsius temperature stays from 4 p.m. right till 10 a.m. So we end up with a 2-temperature system from 24 to 28. So really it has to do with keeping the average temperature up over the 24-hour period, and in particular the nighttime temperature. This is going to vary with systems as well, and also it's going to vary with the weather. So this might be our temperature settings on a thermostat in February, but if you get a cold February day that's very sunny, we may see the temperatures going up to 35 degrees within our greenhouse. So there's always things to watch out for there. And yeah, generally we find managing winter temperatures relatively easy. Now getting into summer, the challenge is trying to keep the temperature down. So we don't really have thermostat settings. What we're trying to do is remove heat as much as we can. So one of our strategies, we're looking at two things. One is fresh air and one is temperature. So in the winter, when we want to keep the temperature up, we bring in fresh air once an hour for 5 or 10 minutes so as to not bring in so much fresh air to bring the temperature down. But in the summer, we're basically bringing in fresh air all the time because the outdoor temperature is almost always going to be lower than the indoor temperature. So by bringing that fresh air in all the time, it's going to keep the temperature down, especially in the overnight portion. And you can see when we get into 12 and 4 o'clock, like we're at 36 to 40 degrees Celsius. And this would be with full shade cloth. And so these are very, very hot conditions. But because we're managing things really well with good airflow, good watering, good hygiene, we can have those high temperatures without having negative effects on the crops. This may or may not work in different environments depending on humidity and things like that. But our goal here, yes, keeping the temperature down, which we're mostly doing by increasing the shade within our growing environment. Much easier to do in a fully contained system with artificial light and heat, But once again, you're not getting the advantage of the sunlight within your system there. So humidity or relative humidity is another huge factor. We talked about this in Module 3 in terms of its contribution. And relative humidity varies significantly with your climate and your geographical location. So it's hard to give general guidelines, but there's a few. So our goal is actually keeping relative humidity at 70% or below. That seems to be what works here. You may find you just need 80% or below, or you actually need it even lower than that where you are. We really avoid water on the ground in the growing environment because that's just going to evaporate up into the atmosphere and contribute to the humidity in the air. And keeping in mind, we're talking about relative humidity. And relative humidity means the amount of humidity in the air relative to how much it can hold. And warmer air can hold more humidity. So by increasing the temperature, you're actually reducing the relative humidity. And it seems kind of counterintuitive in a way, but we've definitely seen when we're monitoring our weather within our system, we can bump up the temperature, see the relative humidity go down, and really see improved growth because of that in the crop. So those are strategies we've used and documented that have worked really well for us. So keep that in mind. We also run a dehumidifier 24 hours a day. So that really makes a big difference. You may or may not need to do that in your system or for a portion of the day. And just keep in mind that dehumidifiers do draw a pretty good amount of energy. So our last aspect of growing to think about is the crop growth period. And that's how long the crop spends from your initial soaking of the seed to its harvest. Now, every crop has its own growth period, which we can influence through temperature and germination time and things like that. Many crops are on about an 8 to 10 day cycle, and these are the crops that I'm looking for in a system because longer cycles in a crop take up more real estate, which means if I have a crop growing in the light, it's taking up the space where the next crop could be coming in. So it's very rarely that I would introduce a crop with more than, say, a 12-day cycle into the system. When we think about the cost of a crop, we think about seeds and soil and energy, but essentially we need to take into account the space that crop takes up as well. Now, it may not seem that way when you just have an 8 to 12 day cycle, but if you have something like basil that might be on a 20 or 30 day cycle, and you're doing 2 harvests a week, you can do the math to see how many rotations of basil you would have going at a time. And you could have 6 to 8 rotations at any given time. So that's going to take up a lot of space. So if you have a lot of space, that's fine. You can grow a wide range of crops. But in most cases where space is limited, really stick to crops that are on an 8 to 12 day cycle. And what I call this is the seed to sale cycle. And if you're selling directly at the farmer's market, I call it the seed to cash cycle. So how quickly you can get that crop to harvest or get it to sale. And the quicker that happens, the quicker you get paid for that crop. And that could be really important in terms of generating cash flow to fund further development of your system. So remember how we talked about before that your harvest day is pretty much set. So if there's anything, you're adapting your sowing day or you're adapting your growing cycles in terms of adjusting temperature. So in the summer, for example, we often shift sowing days 1 day later. So instead of a 9-day growing cycle, crops might have an 8-day growing cycle because we always want to harvest our crop on the same day. We're harvesting that day because we have deliveries we've committed to, and probably because that day or the following day we've got a farmer's market. And we want, in both cases, to be using the freshest product possible. So we're always shifting the sowing date or the cycle in order to get that optimum growth when it comes to harvest time. And as we talked about, changing the temperature and using water stress is one way to really influence crop growth. So this is one that's, I think, hard for people to get their heads around with. Harvesting a day early means you might actually be doing 2 harvests because maybe some of your stuff is ready a day early, but some of it isn't. So harvest setup takes time and harvest cleanup takes time. And the more you do that, the more you're adding to the production cost of your product. The other thing is you want to have the best and freshest product possible. That really is one of your value propositions in a crop that is known to have a very, very short shelf life. So you want to do everything you can to maximize that shelf life. That's one thing that's really adding quality to your product. So this is a very long section, I'm realizing. Much longer than the sowing and sanitation one, so I apologize for misleading you on that. So I'm going to take a look at a crop cycle here with pea, just so you can kind of see all the steps now all in one go to get a sense of what that flow looks like. So we've got our pea stacked, it's gone through its germination process, and we're going to uncover it. Now this here looks like a pretty good time to uncover. I'll throw it out to you right now. Do you think this is early, right on time, or late in terms of uncovering? And don't say it out loud. I can't hear you anyways. But this would be actually a little bit early, and I'm looking at two reasons for this. One reason is those trays are still almost perfectly aligned, and two is that I'm not really seeing the crop come up and grow outside the edges there. So this is either early or very, very close to being optimum. And the reason it's probably being uncovered now is, like, maybe this is a Monday morning, and I know we're not going to be able to get back to do this later in the day, so we're uncovering it a little early because I know the next morning is going to be too late. It might have also just been a characteristic of this seed where we're like, this one seems to do a little better when it's uncovered earlier. So this crop is well germinated, really good rooting in there, and I can see it's really good stem growth, so I'm not worried about that. They're really doing a good job of pushing those top trays up, but they probably could have been covered a bit longer. So this is a pea crop that is actually going through a second covering. So we've taken that crop now and we've laid it out into the light area. And the first thing we're going to do actually is give it some water. Because it's had several days without water, we want to reintroduce some moisture into the soil. And not only is the water good for crop growth, but the moving water in particular is something that many plants really, really like. We're not going to saturate it. We're just giving it a little bit of a fresh rinse. We actually are sort of washing the crop as we go. Now for this one, because we're doing a second covering, and we've already got a crop growing because we're doing 2 harvests a week, we put a mesh tray over top here, and then we use the already growing crop to cover that up. So this process actually would have happened very quickly because we want to get the crop into the dark. We want to keep it in the dark because it will start photosynthesizing if it spends some time in the light. So here what we're doing is we're going to give it an extra day in the dark, and that's going to help stretch it and get it a little bit higher. And you can see a little bit on this crop, if you know pea shoots, this is a little bit short here. I can tell it's short and it's behind its cycle. I can tell the leaves aren't opening up as much as they could. So I can actually see this is probably a winter crop system as well, because pea responds very, very positively to sunlight. So once it's spent a day covered that way, we're uncovering. And this is the same crop. And within a day, it basically doubles in growth. So that second covering really helps stretch the crop. Now we've got it out in the light cycle. We'd give it another watering here, and then we'd be watering on an as-needed basis and until it's ready for our harvest time. So the more time the crop spends in the light, two things happen. One thing is the plants basically eat the sunlight. Basically, it's the protons of light coming down and stimulating electrons to create sugars that the plant uses for energy. This is turning things green and through the process. And then also the other thing is the leaves are starting to open up to more efficiently capture that light as well. So pea is a very particular crop that responds really well to sunlight and really opens up well to the light. When there's insufficient light, as we see in this crop, and this is getting close to harvest, the leaves aren't opening up as much. They're staying really, really closed. And so we'll often, even in cold conditions, move these crops outside into cold where they can get more direct sunlight and really helps open them up. So here we've taken the crop from the germination stage into the light stage. We've greened it up totally and prepared it for harvest here. And I won't go into the harvest part. We've covered that. But every crop is really going to go through those stages, and that's all the stuff we've talked about is the timing of when those things happen and the things we need to do at each of those steps. So that is a look at the crop production process. We're going to take one more look at the crop flow diagram before we move on to the next section, which is the harvest and packing of this crop we've just put so much effort into growing.